Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Pfeiffer, and this is Conversations on Retail. We are so excited to continue Brand Elverston's series on asset protection and risk management. Today, Brand's guest is Chris Hansen, the president of Snug Harbor Consulting. Before we get started, I want to recognize our sponsors. This and every other series on Conversations on Retail is presented by Westrock Coffee Company. With offices in 10 countries, Westrock Coffee sources coffee from 35 different origin countries. To learn more, visit westrockcoffee.com. This series is sponsored by Barcoding, by Rapitag, by Ocucon, and by Everseen. And today's featured sponsor is Everseen. Everseen's computer vision AI technology is trusted by over half of the world's top 15 retailers to mitigate and reduce shrink, streamline operations, and help to deliver a better customer experience. For more information, visit everseen.com or reach out to Chris Taylor, the SVP of Sales. Lastly, just want to remind everyone that this is a conversation, not a presentation. And if you're joining us live, we hope that you will actively participate in the conversation by asking questions, offering insights, and even pushing back if there's something that you don't fully agree with. To do that, simply click the Q&A button in Zoom and submit your questions and comments in writing. If we've got time at the end, we will stop recording and we will open up the microphones and allow for some open discussion. Again, we're so glad that you're here, and let's get started.
Well, welcome everybody. Obviously, Matt introduced me, Brand Elverston. Great to see everybody again on the continuing series of risk mitigation. Two things. One is welcome to Chris Hansen. I don't know, there may be some Walmart guys on here or that listen to the recorded session after we're done, but that's where Chris and I crossed paths on the asset protection corporate staff here in Bentonville, Arkansas. And when I give Chris a chance, he'll go through what year that was. I can't remember, and I'm going to screw it up if I try. But basically, this session, different than a couple of the others, this is pretty much, well, it is focused on safety. And that, as we all know, if we're in retail or any public forum, encompasses a lot of things. It's not just mop the floor when you see a spill. It has evolved. I entered, Chris has got more time in the saddle than I do, but I started in retail in 1995. So I got to see the basics evolve into strategy, evolve into, we're going to talk about today, some technologies specifically designed to bend the needle, if you will. So as Matt said, this is an open conversation. So if a topic tickles your fancy, go ahead and unmute yourself and send it in on the either the chat or the Q&A. I'll see it, and then if we can get to it, we certainly will, because we want this to be a two-way conversation. So, all that rambling aside, Chris, why don't you introduce yourself, if you would, buddy, and don't be humble.
Sure, thank you, Brent. So, Chris Hansen, recently retired. My last assignment was with Rite Aid, where I was the VP of Risk Management, and a couple of other odd jobs along the way. I was there for about 6 years, and prior to that, I was at Walmart, part of the asset protection and safety team. My final assignment there, I was the senior director of safety with responsibility for the program development and rollout for the 4,500 or so retail stores. Prior to that, I was the AVP of risk management for Pathmark supermarket chain in the Northeast. They ultimately were acquired by A&P, which is what brought me to Walmart. And I was the risk manager there for about 14 or so years. But my very first job in retail, it's funny you mentioned it, Brand, was mopping the floors. Okay. I worked for a supermarket chain, a ShopRite store in North New Jersey, about 15 minutes outside of Manhattan. At that time, about 45 years ago, pretty high volume store doing roughly $300,000 a week. And if you translate that to today's dollars, probably just a shade under $2 million. high volume store, kind of a semi-urban area. And it was safety. Safety was something that was not talked about. When you were told to mop the floor so somebody doesn't fall and break their neck was about what the culture was. And I remember early on being involved in a situation where a woman slipped and fell in a produce aisle, which is, the classic stereotype.
Yeah.
And I saw what happened, and, the manager and I had a couple of words, and then I went about my business. And about 3 or 4 weeks later, I showed up for work, and the manager said, "There's somebody I need you to talk to in the office." And turns out it was an adjuster from the insurance company. And he wanted to know this was his investigation. Okay.
Yeah.
Today's store managers do this, but back then he was doing his field investigation. So I told him what I knew. And at the end of the conversation, which wasn't all that lengthy, he said, "Is there anything else you want to add?" I said, "Yeah, I don't know for what it's worth. A few years ago, I had a paper route. And that woman was on my route. And I remember one day she came to the door with her foot in a cast. And he lit up. And I thought to myself, that's something, maybe he can use this. And in my mind back then, I imagined this woman and her ambulance chaser going up against a bunch of, dark blue suit Ivy League attorneys and getting his head handed to him. Well, as years went by, I found out the playing field is actually a lot more level than that, and there's some serious cost associated with things that happen inside your building.
So that's a good segue, dude. What in your estimation? So clearly, hopefully, the mix has changed since certainly before I came on board in '95. What's your sense on the penetration of fraud versus legitimate claims? Say for every dollar that's paid out by a retailer, what would you guess is unmitigated fraud? In other words, we don't have any idea, but it's that scenario you just explained. What would be your guess?
In my mind, and in this particular case, I mean, the woman legitimately fell. I mean, that was apparent. The question was, if she had an injury, did that injury relate to that fall? Okay. Yeah. So, and when I would have conversations with store managers, I would say there's probably a lot less true fraud, classic fraud than you would think. Yeah. But I said, just about every claim has some element of fraud. Okay. And it could be something as small as somebody embellishing what happened, or a physician or a chiropractor that adds a few extra treatments on the tail end, that kind of thing. Those little things can mean a lot. I think what's interesting is, back in the 70s when I was working in the store, deductibles were very low. Companies were insured. Like I said, we got a visit from an insurance adjuster, and it was a cost of doing business. And then shortly after I started working for Pathmark and getting involved in risk management, there was this explosion that happened in the insurance business. It was sort of like the perfect storm. The country was getting a lot more litigious. The ambulance chaser, if you will. Everybody was looking to make a buck, it seemed. Insurance companies, they get their money basically two different ways. One from premiums that they collect, and the other was from investments. Well, the investment piece dried up due to the economy. Claims were going through the roof, and it got to the point where retailers especially had a hard time getting insurance coverage, or they had to raise their deductibles, which now made it a controllable expense, or they couldn't get the kind of limits that they needed. So, you could have, $50 million worth of coverage, but if you got hit with a $60 million settlement or judgment, that other $10 million, that was yours as well as whatever the deductible was. So companies went from having very modest deductibles, or if they had any at all, and wound up with, I mean, today we sit with large corporations with deductibles per accident in the tens of millions of dollars. And because it became a controllable expense, people started to pay a lot more attention to fraud. We in some areas that for us as a regional operator were hotbeds were places like South Philadelphia and Staten Island, neighborhoods where the claim activity was much higher than you would expect, given the store and the volume versus comparable stores. And that was a real eye opener, and ultimately that led us to start to really look to leverage the earliest technology, the CCTV system. And we actually developed, they were so archaic, but we actually developed systems that were standalone from the CCTV system that we used to detect theft and shrink. They were clunky. They were VHS tapes that had to be changed, or you ran the risk of recording over them. And it's interesting because it got to the point where people knew we had cameras, and I had a few adjusters. We administered our claims in-house at the time. I had a few adjusters tell me they would get a call from an attorney to ask if we had video before they committed to their client that they would take the case. They just didn't want the hassle of dealing with physical evidence. So it's out there. Fraud is definitely a component, and I don't think that's changed.
Yeah, I remember, that was kind of new to me because, as you know, and many of the listeners do, my experience before retail was military, so I had not a clue about the risks faced, but it was pretty quick, and it wasn't, unassuming. You mentioned the 1980s, the deregulation party that was going on at the time, and across a number of industries, this seemingly being one in the shakeups, it raised the bar, I think, in the visibility. And you can remember back in our day at Walmart, when we always knew things could get fixed if we mentioned it in the executive meetings or the Friday officers meeting. Mm-hmm. And it became a topic in there, then it was something we needed to focus on. And we were very effective in the stores for a time when those buttons got pushed. And it was largely monetarily driven because, culturally, expenses matter. And when those expenses start going up for something for which the store gains no benefit, it moves the needle. It just, in my mind, has taken years to get from a recognized problem, be it fraud or legitimate, doesn't matter. The accidents happen and the costs simply from the healthcare perspective are staggering. Mm-hmm. So I got to imagine, a simple accident can cost you 10 grand or $1 million or more. It just depends on the severity and the size of the retailer, unfortunately.
And really, a lot of what goes into that average cost of a claim really depends on how the thing is investigated up front.
Yeah.
And how it's handled once all that, used to be paperwork. Now everything obviously is electronic. Yeah. But how quickly someone can get a hold of that person to start to attempt to get control over the situation. Once someone goes to an attorney, that takes it to the next level, okay? Because the attorney is going to invest some time and some money, and if it can't be settled at that level, then it goes into litigation. Now the serious work starts to begin, and that elevates the cost. And ultimately, you find yourself either on the courthouse steps or in the courthouse trying to settle something because, as the insured or as the mm-hmm. retailer, you don't like the way things are going. You don't like the cards that you're holding versus what that the plaintiff has. And so that investigation and the way it's handled, really critical to the outcome.
Yeah, if we fast forward to today, and there are a couple of companies I have personal experience with, either worked with them at Walmart or work with them now. specific to this conversation, the slip, trip, and falls is Occucom, a company based out of overseas across the pond. And in our earlier conversations, really the discerning factor with them is being able to detect clear liquid on a floor. So I think your comments earlier before we went live were, there are others out there that can detect when there's contrast. So Coke on a white floor or milk on a polished concrete floor, it's pretty easy to see with the naked eye. So logically you can see it through the camera. But when you put water on a white floor, or any floor where there's no contrast, it becomes increasingly difficult to be able to do that and alert soon enough to prevent an accident. So it's virtual real time. Notifications are sent, and then it is up to the store, of course, the execution of response, whether they have somebody on SMS texting or an email or however they choose to be alerted. And some of the retailers are experiencing not only getting their arms around the risk more quickly, but the downstream effect, which, as you and I both know, the real goal is changing behavior. It's awesome to read the news, but you know what? I can buy a newspaper to tell me that I need to bend the needle, change the behavior, and prevent these things from happening in the first place. And we started seeing in unnamed retailers, for obvious reasons, so the equipment used to squeegee the floors, the floor machines, be it robotics or manned, were leaving residue on the floors. And those were being identified by the AI saying, hey, you have a slip hazard. Up towards the entrances of the stores, being able to give a retailer, let's just say they've got 100 cameras in the store. If you lay this AI on 100 cameras, you're going to probably figure out 20 of them are really where 90% of your challenges come from. You don't see many spills in domestics or apparel basics or electronics. You see it over in the expected areas, some at TLE, entrances and exits, and produce, and deli and meat and on that side, and dairy and those kinds of areas where something will hit the floor. So Occucon is one of those guys that really has that market secured. I'm not going to say you don't have competitors. You always have competitors. Are you familiar with any other, not that we want to get into, naming companies, but we mentioned the technology, and that's really where we've evolved to in the industry. That's what's going to change it. Yeah. So what are your thoughts?
This was something, as I mentioned before we jumped on, something that I had been approached about years ago, probably 20 years ago. And at that time, to call it AI would be a gross exaggeration. Okay. Yeah. At the time, I viewed it as being a solution in search of a problem. Okay. The guy had something, and he was just trying to grasp at straws. When you mention so the AI told you there's a problem, somebody has to react. There's basically, obviously, first up front, you want to identify the problem. Okay, so if you're in retail, it's the problem is slips and falls, number one. If you're talking about your employees, they slip and fall as well, but then you've also got, ergonomic type injuries, sprains, strains, and that sort of thing. So you identify, okay, this is the problem I'm trying to go after. Now, what are the tools I have? Okay, what are the solutions I can use? And that's really where your response or your countermeasure really falls into one of three areas. Okay, the first would be training and education, and that could go along with, responding to a system prompt. Okay, people need to understand what's expected of them, or they need to understand how to work safely and that sort of thing. The second is a process improvement. Okay, and that's where, you might say that's where this AI technology would fall into that category, because now you're saying instead of having somebody walking up and down the aisles doing a checklist or that sort of thing, that's where you're leveraging your technology. Okay, it doesn't goof off, it doesn't take breaks, etc. Right? So that's a process change. The third opportunity is to really design in and engineer and control. Okay, And of those three, the engineering control, if it's the proper countermeasure, is the most effective because it stands alone. And I give an example I could share is, we mentioned produce. Back when I was early in my risk management career, we identified that 20% of all slips and falls happened in the produce aisle. Okay, it's wet, it's messy. Matter of fact, in some states, New Jersey is one of them. Liability is a given. If somebody slips and falls in your produce department, you can't use notice. You can't say, well, my employees didn't have a chance to see that, okay, which is something that AI brings to the forefront. What we ultimately did was we changed the type of floor tile that we used in a produce department. We went with a quarry tile that had a very, very rough aggregate. And I'll tell you, it was a monster to try to keep clean because things like that will attract more dirt and grime. But beyond that, it was extremely difficult for somebody to slip and fall, even if the surface was wet. That's the engineering control. And I would say any time you're trying to address, what is the issue, and you get down to the root cause, then you can, if you look at your possible solutions, falling into one of these three buckets or a combination, it helps to bring things into focus, I think, and ultimately you can implement, do some proof of concept, and if you've selected the right choice, you can pretty quickly, if you've got good data, you can pretty quickly make a determination as to whether or not you're on the right track and roll it out more broadly.
Yeah, and I'm going to kind of shift gears because this is all under the safety. So clearly, as you said, these slip and trips are a huge liability. I don't care what retailer you are, it's always a risk, and it's a very expensive risk. Since probably the late 90s, if you wanted to put a date on it, the new risk, when you talk to tier one asset protection, loss prevention, or safety executives at any tier one retailer, for the first time in my 25 years, almost 30, in retail, is active shooter. If I ever sat down, and Chris, my background, I was on staff at Walmart for those 22 years. So I was firsthand to both strategy and tactics. And, safety, if you had to ask a VP, what is your number one concern? It was always shrink, closely followed by safety. But safety, in my memory, was never number one, except for moments in time when it had the visibility or we had a catastrophic incident in a store, something of that nature. It was always shrink. Well, that changed in the last few years. And I remember not long after I retired, I was called by a certain retailer and asked, look, we have this risk. Everybody on the planet's got it if you're in a public forum, of the active shooter. So what we need you to find technology that can alert us early on to a weapon or an impending situation. And I remember I was down in Fayetteville on a bike ride, having a cup of coffee, and the VP was just, look, here's what we need. And I'm like, well, okay, I hear you. And I kind of chuckled, and I'm like, look, I've got contacts all over the globe, everything from MIT to Caltech, Georgia Tech, Boeing, you name it. So let me do some homework. I did, came back, and the unanimous answer was yes, but it's all on a whiteboard. This was 2017. And they said, yeah, AI will get there, but it ain't ready. It's just not that reliable to be able to say, here comes Billy Bob, from 150 feet out in the parking lot. Then 2018 came around, and another provider, founded by Navy SEALs in 2018, ZeroWise, has that solution. Yes, there are others. There are acoustic detectors, which don't require visual, but that's telling you bang. Okay, you heard a gunshot. There are systems that work at much less range inside the store. But the advantage of the advanced warning is tell me when I have time to do something about it. Don't tell me after 10 people have been gunned down. So let's shift to that. Is your sense from your wealth of experience Has the priority shifted from physical safety of associates and customers, or is that a misread, or is that unique to Tier 1?
No, I think it's definitely a concern. It's just one more thing getting added to the plate.
Yeah.
Because the frequency is, seems to be growing. Okay.
2 a day for the year, and that was consistent last year.
What I've seen so far is people are taking action on what to do in the moment. Okay, with training and education, spotting someone who looks suspicious. Okay, and then telling someone, well, that's something I think where AI can certainly come into play at some point, just like identifying a problem on the floor, right? And companies are doing a good job with training and educating people on what to do, the run, hide, fight, mantra, that sort of thing.
The run, hide, fight, yeah.
Yeah, but ultimately, I think, to your point, if there's detection that there was a gunshot in the parking lot, to give people the ability to react and lock down or shelter in place or what have you, is really going to become more and more important. And it's broader than just the active shooter, active assailant, because guns are not the only way that people, cause harm.
Yeah.
And there's that spectrum. I mean, the active shooter is the worst case nightmare scenario, right? But people who work in stores deal with all types of violence on a sliding scale. Okay, and it's from in its simplest form, it's a misbehaving customer who's disgruntled over a refund policy or the speed of checkout or something like that. Then you have you have people who threaten to come back. I'll show you, those sorts of scenarios. You have personal matters with boyfriends and husbands and wives and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
If you don't have a program in place to detect what's happening in the lives of the people who work for you, you certainly, I think, leave yourself exposed. But to have something that could alert to the fact that suspicious behavior, basically something that's out of sorts, the trench coat in the summertime sort of thing that could be concealing a rifle. I think that's ultimately now. The challenge is that it's pricey, certainly, and you're dealing with something that when you look at the quadrants of risk, this is even though it's a headline item, it's extremely low frequency and extremely high severity. Okay. Slips and falls are moderate severity, higher frequency. Okay. Those are the things that we can manage with the tools that we have today. The challenge is when you have something like that, that's, that 1 in a million or 1 in 10 million, that's where companies typically look for insurance to fill that gap. Okay. And what's happening right now is liability insurance companies are kind of stepping back and saying, hey, this is not what we signed up for. Okay. And you're starting to see exclusions in liability policies over things like active shooter, active assailant. This is not a new phenomenon. We saw it happening to liability insurance policies with opioids for those who have pharmacies, with cannabis for those who simply wanted to offer some cannabis products in their stores. We saw it happen, years back with pollution. Okay, where liability policies used to cover pollution, but that became such an unwieldy risk that got carved out. Now, when the insurance markets make that decision, eventually somebody always comes in to fill the void. The problem right now is the very few solutions that are being offer very what I would consider to be subpar coverage. Okay, because it's an unknown for them as well. So you really find yourself kind of between a rock and a hard place.
So let's talk about duty of care. So at some point, if you have enough exclusions in insurance policies, like flood insurance in Florida, coastal residences on Florida, they've gotten their brains beat out with hurricanes and all sorts of things. So at what point, if there are several, if not many, solutions that are out there. So you have advance warning, and it's based on visual. I want to be clear. It's not acoustic, it's visual. So I can tell Billy Bob's out in the truck in the parking lot, 150 feet out, he just pulled a shotgun off the rack. We can alert on that, or these technologies can alert on that. I don't know the range of the acoustic things, but clearly that's telling you a shot's already been fired. So if you have enough of those solutions out there, and lawyers being lawyers, at some point there becomes a basic obligation of security for your patrons. How do you read that? I know you're not a lawyer, but you've been around long enough to be able to sniff it out. What do you see that?
You're right. A retailer has a general duty of care. Okay, now again, it's another sliding scale. When you talk about employees who are very familiar with the workplace and what have you,
yep.
They, because of their familiarity, the duty of care, so to speak, would actually be a little lower than it would be for a customer who is your business invitee. Okay, they're unfamiliar with their surroundings, and you kind of owe it to them to do the right thing. That's certainly true with slips and falls, right? The courts have borne that out. And I could see this heading in the same direction. Obviously, OSHA, unless you're talking about employees, OSHA doesn't come into play because that's strictly occupational. So that doesn't impact your customer base, right?
Good distinction.
But and that's really kind of an important distinction. Your employees are also covered by workers' compensation. So if they're harmed, knife, gun, what have you, workers' compensation is going to be their sole remedy unless you did something so egregious or you were so absolutely negligent beyond anything comprehensible that a reasonable person would do. The plaintiff bar is excluded from filing a third-party claim. But obviously, that's not true with customers. As solutions continue to mature and develop, as they start to get ingrained, then that is kind of a backdoor way of saying, okay, now the bar's being raised in terms of what a retailer's obligation is. It's interesting. I was involved a couple of years back with a very tragic situation in one of our distribution centers in Maryland, where we had a disgruntled contract employee. It was a combination of our people and contractors working in the distribution center. She got into an argument with somebody at the time clock as soon as she was getting ready to punch in. She left the building, went home and got a pistol, came back, and using her ID badge, she carted back into the building and she started the fire. And she hit, I think, 6 or 7 people. She killed a couple and then turned the gun on herself. We did have a tragic situation. We did have a lawsuit eventually filed by one of the family of a contract employee who was killed. The trial court actually gave my company summary judgment. In other words, the plaintiff had not even made a strong enough case to get to court. The plaintiff appealed, and it went to the appellate division, and the appellate court upheld the summary judgment. So, the court ruled basically, and we made 2 arguments. The first argument we made was that an employee can't sue an employer. Well, they said, no, this person was not your employee. This was a contract employer. So that workers' comp protection doesn't apply.
Yeah.
But what they did say was, and the arguments they made was these people wore special vests. They didn't go to company meetings. They weren't part of the supervisory team, et cetera, et cetera. They reported to a different hierarchy. So we lost that argument. But the argument that we prevailed on had to do with the fact that it was viewed as being not foreseeable. Okay. No one knew that this woman was bipolar. Nothing came up in background checks and things that her employer had done, okay, which would have potentially have caught something. So this family never had their day in court. That will probably shift with time as the duty of care increases over time. But like I said, at least at this juncture, it wasn't felt that there was even enough to go to take it to trial.
Yeah. So dovetail on duty of care that I think we all recognize there's going to be very little meaningful legislation to mitigate active shooter risk. I mean, I think it's safe to say that ship sailed. So, and you may have seen some of the things, some of the listeners may have seen the discussions I've had on LinkedIn posts on if we know that's never really going to happen. And, the toothless response of thoughts and prayers and condemnation, et cetera, it's a broken record. So is there appetite beyond duty of care to be able to say, look, we have been required to have a fire extinguisher, safety cones, safety glass, push out doors on the main entrances of grocers. So it's a two-way door, a breakout door for a fire alarms, fire suppression systems, safety plugs on electrical sockets. It goes on forever. Seat belts were required before I was born. It kills me every time I get on an airplane and they still talk about how to put one on. I'm like, you got to be kidding. Nobody on this plane is that old to remember not having to do it. And I put myself in that bucket. I'm like, you kidding me, right? But, number one, who would be the agency to say, look, you have to have some sort of mitigation for slip and trips because enough technologies are out there. You got to pick something that meets these minimum standards, just like fire extinguishers and code and active shooter in the same bucket.
But
who would be that agency?
When you think about your employees, okay, in that scenario, the agency would be OSHA.
Okay.
OSHA typically develops their standards from other authoritarian sources. Okay. So, for example, OSHA's got standards on walking and working surfaces and exit doors and panic bars and all that kind of stuff. They basically came from the building codes.
Okay.
So ANSI codes are another source. The Uniform Fire Code is another one that they leverage. And on the customer side, on the liability side, it's the plaintiff attorney who's trying to make the argument, right? So they will rely on expert testimony, people who are very intimately involved with what the prevailing duty of care is. Because what the plaintiff is trying to do is show that what you did was less than what's generally accepted. Okay. So if everybody else has wet floor signs in their stores and you don't, shame on you. Okay. And that will be the same argument to some extent with things like active shooter and assailant. So what I think ultimately it will come down to is what will the standard be? Okay. And now who that authority, because it's not going to be something I think that the legislature will dream up, on their own. And God help us if they do, because I don't think that's something anybody wants. But it's, it's going to be important for people to keep their ear to the ground and just be aware of what's happening around them, because you don't want to be the outlier.
Well, you bring that up. I was in a Walmart store this morning with another client walking the store, and I don't know when it started, but for a few years now, I don't walk into any public space and not have active shooter in my head at some point, even a movie theater. You get comfortable, you kick back, you got a beer or popcorn or whatever, and then my brain shifts to how the hell do I get out of here if some clown comes in down at the bottom, because there ain't you got to go down to get out.
Yeah.
How do you do that? And it crossed my mind this morning. We had a brief conversation on it in the Walmart store here in Bentonville. I'm like, I hate to say it, but I look at people differently, shoppers, be it, front of mind or subliminal, but it's still there.
And I think that's because of who you are and what your life experience is. I'm the same way.
Yeah.
Even when I go into a restaurant, I'm looking for the table in the corner with my back to the wall.
Yeah.
But that's because of what I've seen and what I've been involved in with developing training programs and things like that.
So do you see? So let's fast forward and say we're going to do the right thing. We collectively, Commerce, the Business Roundtable. And we both know some very senior executives, leaders in the industry that are on the Business Roundtable. To be able to not be legislated, but come to a common agreement of, guys, this isn't going away. So we need to build ahead of legislation some sort of duty of care before we are forced into it, or do we continue to pay out hundreds of millions of dollars on a mass shooting in a store? Which, pick your retailer. One you and I are familiar with, 19 people died in El Paso. So I'm confident that was tens of millions of dollars all in monetary losses, payouts potentially to families, closed business, reputational risk, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah,
it's a staggering amount of money per incident. And back to your point on the ROI, I get it. If I've got, if I'm a small regional retailer and I have 300 stores, why would I pay somebody even $1,000 a year per store for something that, when you do the odds, it's like playing the lottery? No different than back in the day with recalls being issued by the big auto manufacturers. Like, it's cheaper for us to pay a lawsuit than it is to do a recall. So we're going to be okay with it.
Yeah, but the challenge, whatever technology or system that folks come up with, the proof of concept phase is going to be extremely difficult because of the low frequency aspect.
Yep.
Okay. For example, when we changed floor tiles in a produce department, we saw slips and falls go down. But that's because we were dealing with a moderate frequency type of accident.
Yep.
So the more frequency you have, the shorter your window that you need to evaluate if your countermeasure is effective. Okay. Yep. So if you do this in 10 stores and you see frequency go down in 10 stores, you're onto something. Doing a proof of concept for something like what you're describing is going to be extremely difficult.
Sure.
You might be able to measure your response to something that doesn't look right, and that's measurable. Mm-hmm. But you might have, 100, 1,000 of those types of situations where something appeared wrong. But in fact, it was just someone who was confused or had a problem with medication or whatever the case might be.
Yeah, I was in Germany a couple of weeks ago at EuroShop. You remember that massive retail conference over there? It dwarfs anything in the U.S. Just shy of 100,000 attendees, and it's probably about 15 to 18 convention halls full of everything retail. So an entire convention hall will be mannequins. Another one will be marketing. Another one will be HVAC systems. And of those 15, typically there are 3 to 4, if not more, that are nothing but tech. And I did see, and I'm not going to mention the name because I only mention names of companies that I've vetted and I get under the hood, is a company that does exactly that through your existing camera network that suggests to be able to predict nefarious activity. It's largely focused on shoplifting. So, it's no different than automating what a shoplifter, catcher, or in-store investigator or detective, whatever you want to call it, they're looking at the same thing. Is the guy looking around constantly, looking up, see what cameras are there? Back to your point, is he wearing a down coat and it's 80 degrees outside? All that kind of stuff. If it's a guy and it's over in the cosmetic section, things that just something's not right here, that they can alert on that real time and be able to say, you got something. And in my experience, the expense of getting it wrong oftentimes kills the initiative of the product. So, for example, can you imagine identifying through, let's talk about facial recognition. You put it in, it works, it knows that's Chris Hansen walking in the door. If I have a picture file to match him to, it's not going to the CIA or NSA to say, who is this clown? It matches it against somebody for which the store has an interest, whatever that is. And the risk becomes, okay, so what? You identified Chris Hansen. Yep, he killed his wife or did something crazy. There's an outstanding warrant. The business case falls apart. It's so what? Because do you really want your store associates, store personnel, movie theater attendants, whatever, walking up to that person, hoping like hell it's 100% right, and intervene? And then you and I know from all our retail experience, people get hurt. So it becomes almost a double-edged sword. Is the what's the right word? The accuracy, I guess, of determination is a risk, and that's all it takes is one bad ID. As you and I well know, a bad stop in retail can be millions.
That's exactly right. It's how valid your system is at picking these things up, and we're talking about things that can be very nuanced. The same person who looks shifty, who's looking around for cameras because they want to swipe something off the shelf, may be the same person who is thinking about, pouring a bottle of oil on the floor and taking a dive. Okay. Right. And potentially could be the same person who's looking to see if anybody's around because they're about to do somebody some serious harm. Yeah. The technology is the first piece. The second piece is, okay, so now what do I do with that information?
That's right.
Do I call the authorities? Is that the prudent thing to do?
That's where it always fell apart in my experience without getting into specifics. It's like, okay, so what, Brand? You identified them. And without some sort of human intervention in the loop, to be able to say, okay, no, that's actually not Chris Hansen. It's not even close. And being able to intervene before that bad guidance gets released. No different than, the active shooter. Let's go back to that with Zero Eyes. They have a manned staff, 2 operation centers, one in Hawaii, one up in Pennsylvania. Every alert that comes in goes to a veteran first, real time, to look at and say, no, that is not a long gun or a pistol, and they're all veterans for a reason. They know what wrong looks like. Even though they do a ton of training, they get it. And a decision is made within 3 to 5 seconds to dispatch alert to the retailer, to the cops, whatever, the 911, all the string of notifications that happen. But if you're in facial recognition, or if you're in anything that could be catastrophic, really has to be shored up before that's even palatable in retail. Different scenario with slip, trip, falls. Okay, so I sent Chris the risk management person at the store to something that really wasn't a spill. Yeah, that's irritating. And you get enough of them, they're going to get tone deaf, just like the electronic article surveillance systems. And, the alarm goes off 86 times a day. Nobody's paying attention to that. So you become tone deaf, but there's no catastrophe that happens because Chris went out there. The worst case that happens, he gets hacked off by having to walk all the way, 14 miles to the other side of the store. But in those other scenarios, human intervention is required because AI simply isn't there yet.
Yeah, exactly. And it's the kind of thing, certainly you have to have all of your constituents on board with you. Okay, this is the kind of thing that would legal, your executive leadership, everybody has to be on the same page. Because ultimately, if something does go wrong, somebody's going to have to pick up the pieces. Somebody's going to have to defend the organization.
Well, if you put, and so you've been in big retail, the world's biggest retailer, all the way down to regional retail. If you put something in 10 stores and you have an event in the 11th store, then it falls back on duty of care. And you and I both have been part of those conversations inside retail. It's like, wait a minute, you had this in 10 stores. Why in the hell didn't you have it in this one where you just had an abduction, a murder, whatever, name your catastrophe? Does that come back around to duty of care, or what's the defense?
When you think along those lines, okay, companies have always been comfortable putting countermeasures in. Let's say you're in a higher crime environment. Okay, yep. Everybody is very comfortable putting in security, patrol vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. But everyone is gun shy about when can you take those additions away. Mm-hmm. Okay, nobody wants to be the person who pulled the coverage and then 3 weeks later there's an assault in the parking lot. But if you have data, you can at least say, this is the argument I made, okay? And it was around what's happening in the community, scoring or what have you. But with this active shooter scenario, you don't have that geography element, right?
That's right.
The guy who shot up the store in Buffalo was not from Buffalo. He came from 3 states away, I believe.
Yeah.
Didn't even have an axe to grind. We had a situation at my last employer where a guy randomly got off an interstate, pulled into a parking lot, walked into the last aisle in the store where he saw a woman packing out product onto the shelves and hacked her up with a knife. No connection to the store, no connection to her. We at first thought it was the classic husband, boyfriend.
Sure.
That quickly went out the window. To this day, it just appears to have been some random occurrence by somebody who had no connection to anything locally. So that adds another element of complexity. Okay, what criteria do you use to decide where I put it and where don't I?
Yeah, retailers. I got to imagine any retailer of any size, and certainly among the tier ones, they got more data than they know how to synthesize and extract actionable information out of it. Some better than others, but you do get to that point where you do your, I don't know what the legal phrase is, but you do your best. The best intent is there to be able to say, these are my tiers of risk. 4 buckets from dumpster fire stores to, cakewalk in the middle of a senior community in Florida. Depending on the risk you're trying to mitigate. And you're right, retailers do have those external sources, the FBI crime statistics, you have CapEx, you have all sorts of demographic data you can sprinkle in. In today's world, most all retailers know exactly who their shoppers are and what the demographic is by store. Rogers, Arkansas is a different demographic than Bentonville, different than, Overland Park, Kansas versus San Francisco. To be able to slice that up. In my mind, that's about the only defense, if you will, when that argument comes. You had it in 10, but you didn't have it in the number 11. You're at risk, or you're liable. No, because here's the methodology we used that made sense. It's got to make sense, obviously.
Yeah, that with the truly random attacker, because there is no pattern, because there is no connection. That's really the challenge.
Yeah.
But what you can do is have your ears to the ground and know what's happening in your people's lives. Okay, if you get wind that somebody is acting strange or acting uncomfortable, is there a reason? Is it because of a serious marital situation? Is it because of a family issue? That kind of thing. Is there a problem between two associates within a store? That sort of thing that could ultimately lead to violence. Okay, the known attacker. You're really just sort of like the known unknown, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. To do the best you can with trying to address those sorts of issues. But for the situation that's truly random, that just
it's virtually impossible. You're right. I mean, you think about these active shooter situations, it is random. You gave two great examples, guys from 3 states away. There is no AI, even if you will, that can determine that this guy, short of what was the TV show that came out that did the predictive analytics? Person of interest. Mm-hmm. So I got on the flight over to Germany. I was watching show after show after show of Person of Interest because I hadn't seen it in a few years. But that, to me, is exactly that, is the predictive. We know, be it futuristic, but still, you have a prayer on being able to get ahead of the game and mitigate before you're, in the reactionary mode of, okay, 20 people got shot in the store. Give me 20 ambulances, cops, SWAT team, how the strategy unfolds at that point. We have 3 minutes left for the audience. If you guys have any questions, Matt, I do not see anything in the Q&A or the chat box. Correct me if I'm wrong. But we will continue the conversation, but we're really doing a wind up. If somebody has a question, please feel free to submit in Q&A at the bottom center-ish of your screen, and give Chris some attention. Yeah. He looks entirely too relaxed.
The challenge is, if you think about the difference between a distribution center and a retail store.
Yeah,
in a distribution center, it's much easier to control access. Yep. You can double chamber people before they can get into the facility, things like that. But retail, by its nature, is an open door.
Yeah. Well, that's, in national security strategy space, I'm going to a conference in D.C. this weekend on national security and policy. Think tanks running it in D.C. And one of the topics they're going to talk about is the very essence of democracy, or the inherent vulnerabilities in that society, the freedom, just what you just said.
Yeah.
You can't have, security guards and 6 layers of security blankets before you enter a Target store to go shopping. You don't get patted down. It's not TSA, et cetera. So those are vulnerabilities, but I just feel like in our space and our experience, there's more that can be done responsibly than simply looking at, how much is this going to cost me to do it? And is it cheaper to do a payout for the unlikely event I have a mass shooting incident, or do I spend $3-4 grand a year to protect my exterior cameras on a store and give me a heads up so I can lock down, I can do the run, hide, fight, automatically notify 911. All of that stuff can happen. And they're in a lot of schools. That's where they really started. And they've been very successful in incident detection in schools. So anyway, Matt, we have 1 minute. I don't know how many seconds because it's a computer. So I'm going to take the wrap-up time. Chris, 2 things, buddy. Number 1, it's awesome to see you again. I know we had some fun times with mutual frustration in Floyd. And you always kept it light. You always had some smart-ass comment to kind of take the edge off of it. I'm like, you know what? Chris is right. Hell with it.
I did pay for that, though.
That's okay, brother. Don't we all? So I greatly appreciate it. You are in consulting, am I right now? Or
Really, I'm doing a little teaching.
okay, awesome.
Couple times a year just to keep engaged with things. That's
Okay.
all.
All right. So for the listeners and those that listen to the recorded event later, when Matt puts it out on social media, I'm sure I'll speak for Chris that he's okay with it. Ping Chris. He's on LinkedIn. Send him a direct message. He's got a wealth of knowledge, 45 years in retail, from everything from the world's biggest on the planet all the way to small regional retailers. So I'm sure you would invite questions and thoughtful conversation around this costly topic.